Hey guys. Well, we're going live for tonight, and I'm just waiting on Anya to join me, and then we're gonna get into it. Anya, when you join, can you just. There you are. Awesome. I'm just adding you now.
Can you hear me?
Yay! I can hear
Hi.
you.
Hello, how are you?
Hey!
Yeah,
Good. Obviously, you can hear
perfect
me then.
today. Yeah,
Perfect. For this tonight. We've been wanting
me
to do it for like
too.
forever.
Yes, it's a hot topic for both of us. So
Yes, for sure.
happy to be here. Thank you for those that are joining us.
Yeah. When you join, just give us a wave or say hi or and also feel free to participate as we go throughout our live. Like if you have questions or comments or anything to add, please do. We love that.
We do. Yeah, this is an open space for discussion. We don't know everything. We don't try and pretend we do.
What are you saying? Of course we know everything. I'm
Of
joking.
course.
Total experts on all things in life.
Yeah, everything.
Self-proclaimed and
Um,
all.
oh yeah. Um, So I guess today we wanted to talk about diversity within sustainable fashion and I guess
Yes.
fashion in general in the world. And this is a pretty hot topic at the moment. We
Mm.
see seeing a lot of fashion companies getting on board with diversity, a lot of tokenistic diversity happening, I feel, if I can say that.
Oh, go for it.
And
I would totally agree.
And I guess this is something we've been exploring, particularly with our work within Sustainability 5.0, this platform, how we can bring more diverse voices and ways of doing and being and creating into the space.
Mm.
So I guess for those of you that don't know, Amy wrote an amazing article. Is it on our link tree?
Yeah, it
Actually,
is. Yeah,
okay, it's on our link tree, and it was
I
called
think.
the real.
Yeah.
It was called "The Real Revolution Is." Can you help me here, Amy? What was the end of it? The real revolution,
Um,
the real fashion
should
revolution.
yeah, it's called why the real fashion revolution should be the decolonization of the industry or something like that.
Yeah, and so for those of you who haven't read it, go and read it because it gives a really beautiful and diverse perspective of sustainable fashion initiatives at the moment and perhaps some ways of going forth that may bring us towards a more inclusive space and future. Amy, do you want to perhaps talk about it a little bit? Or
Sure. I guess like you said, it's such a hot topic right now, diversity itself. But I think what I'm noticing, and I don't know if this is the same for you, but what I'm noticing is that the conversation around diversity seems to be more about the representation of diverse, I
mm,
guess, races on the runway or in print and media and things like that. It doesn't
mm,
how we like the diversity of voices included and the
mm,
diversity of solutions that are included in the
mm,
conversation around sustainability. And while the aspect of diversity within representation of who's on runways and things like that is super important, is only a small part of the diversity conversation. And I
mm,
feel like yeah, like you said, there's a lot of tokenism that goes in that's going on at the moment in that
Yeah.
space. I've really noticed a lot of brands starting to add a little bit more diversity to who's wearing their clothes and what they're showing on their social media or
Mm,
in terms of who they're photographing and who they have on their runways. But like you said, for a lot of brands, it really does come across as being tokenistic because, um, you know, if you just have a brown face out of every, like for example, if you're looking at Instagram, I've been looking at a few brands on Instagram. If there's one brown face in every 100 squares, that's not that's not diversity. That's just tokenism.
mm,
And I've seen a lot of brands doing that. I've also seen a lot of brands doing some awesome stuff and really, really actually having a diverse representation of cultures and races on, um, you know, that they're showing their clothes on. But
mm,
like I said, I feel like that conversation isn't extending beyond the physical representation into the space where we're having diverse ways of thinking represented. And I think that's, a huge part of why we wanted to have this conversation tonight.
mm. Are you still there, Amy?
Yeah, can
Just
you hear me?
I can hear you. You've just frozen, but I'm not
Oh,
sure if
okay.
anyone else has seen that. But I guess we can still keep going. Yeah, I think what I call particularly kind of that is prevalent in the Western world, and we see it so much in sustainability and sustainable
Yeah.
fashion, where I'm guilty as charged. You want to really you want to do something amazing for the world, and you want to help, and you want to help all these impoverished people in other countries and create sustainable clothing. And what we don't realize is that can actually have a damaging effect. That can actually take power away from these other communities when we're not actually engaging with them, when we're not asking them what they need, when we're not making space at the table for them to represent themselves.
Mm.
And yeah, like I said, I'm guilty of doing that myself in the past, and I think it is a big problem because there is so many people that from Western Eurocentric backgrounds that are trying to do work in this space, but they kind of, it's solutions and initiatives thrown at other people,
Mm.
like workers, like minority groups, differently abled people, etc. So how can we make room at the table for these people to represent themselves?
Mm. Yeah, and that's the big question, I think, because when we're talking about diversity, it is so multifaceted, and there's so many areas in which we need to kind of clear space for people to be invited to the table. Um, and there's no, and it's quite a big conversation, like you said, about the missionary complex that I wrote about in the article. That it's a hard conversation to have because, like
Mm,
you said, I've been there before too. I feel like a lot of us have been there where we have this desire to help and to,
mm,
like, we come with we start off with these genuinely good intentions, but if we're not actually investigating, what's going on, I guess, behind the scenes, what kind of system are we operating within, then we're not able to identify that actually our response is coming. Um, our response is coming from a Eurocentric Western
mm,
viewpoint, and it's not actually inclusive of the people who were
mm,
supposedly trying to help, because we're not
mm,
actually including them at the table to have a self-represented, you know, it's not a co-creative process the majority of the
Mm,
time. When it is a co-creative process, that's a completely different story. But for the majority of the time, this isn't a co-creative process, and it's coming across as if sustainable brands or designers are going in with this intention to create and a very a genuine intention to create jobs and opportunities for people, and to create sustainable alternatives. And yet when we do that without realizing the system that we're operating within, what we're doing is actually more about us than it
yeah.
is about the person that we're supposedly serving. um,
Mm,
and I wrote in that article, and I felt like it was quite a controversial thing to say, but I feel like it's something important to bring to the table and to have a conversation about, is movements like Fashion Revolution, where if we honestly look at it and we have a little bit of perspective and we look at the fact that our fashion system is situated within a colonial operating system, and that's the
mm,
way it has been, it's the way it currently is, it's the way it's been for a very long time. um, if we look at it from that perspective and we look at movements like Fashion Revolution, we can draw some correlations between the missionary movements of the colonial
mm,
times, because who is best served by that movement? The
mm,
person who is best served by movements like that are actually the consumer. It's more about the consumer feeling as if they're involved in
mm,
initiating some form of change with brands than it is actually about the person that it's
mm,
supposedly for. Because those people who it's for are not actually being brought to the table to self-represent, um, in the solution finding. And although we're asking who's made my clothes and questions like this, and I'm not. This is not to say that this is not important or to put it down or anything like that, because I feel like this is doing really, there's really great work being done. I feel like
mm,
there is, it's important to have this here, but I do think it's also important to realize that when movements like that gain a lot of traction and we look at it as a solution, as like
mm,
the fashion revolution, the thing that's going to change everything, it's a dangerous thing to look at it from that viewpoint, because we're not actually making space at the table. And when we're
mm,
not making space at the table, we're furthering a colonial system, and we're furthering those kinds of values.
mm,
And if we genuinely want systemic change, we actually are going to have to really ask the hard questions, have the hard conversations, make space at
mm,
the table for other viewpoints, for other
mm,
people to be representing themselves rather than us representing them, and not actually knowing where they're coming from or what their
mm,
true needs are or how they would like to be represented.
mm,
Um, and I think that's, I guess, where I'm coming from when it comes to the diversity conversation right now. Um,
mm,
yeah.
mm. So it's like these systems, these initiatives we're trying to put in place to ultimately create a sustainable world are really only perpetuating, perhaps, the old systems we're trying to run away from in a way, perpetuating the
I think
colonial
they are.
systems.
Yeah, I mean, I think they are. If with the evolution of those movements, we don't realize that, okay, initially when these movements start, they're very grassroots, and
Mm,
they're just about doing something, and the intention behind
mm,
them is really pure. But as they evolve, like this has been several years now, as they've evolved, it's important to evolve with that movement.
yeah.
So now that it's gained this traction, it's important that the conversation is furthered, that that people are invited to the table to represent themselves, that it's not continuing from year to year with the exact same
Mm,
questions, or there has to be more of an evolution. I mean, that's just
Mm,
my personal feelings about it. I don't
mm,
feel like as a whole, the sustainability movement is inclusive at all. Um,
no,
it
it's
pretends to
not.
be, but I really don't feel like it's an inclusive movement
No,
in
it's
any
not.
way or form or shape or um, and any time that it is, even just mentioning inclusivity or mentioning other viewpoints is always represented by a Western, uh,
Mm,
a Westerner or um, from a Western context and a
mm,
Western interpretation rather than self-represented. And that in part means that us, those of us who come from other backgrounds or other, or like with you and I with the Sustainability 5.0, with other viewpoints coming in and making, and like
mm,
it's like that quote, um, if there's not space at the table for you, just pull up your lawn chair and bring your
mm.
lawn chair, sit down.
Yeah,
It's other designers with other viewpoints or creatives with other viewpoints or cultures with
mm,
other viewpoints actually just pulling up the lawn chair and saying, "Okay, I'm here now. That's it.
yeah,
This has gone on long enough. Now I'm going to represent myself. You can no longer represent me." Um,
yeah,
uh, and I think that's beginning to happen, but I
mm,
think it's essential if we're
yeah,
going to talk about diversity that we talk about it far beyond who's represented on runway or in media or any of that.
absolutely. And it's like, how do we make space at the table for others? Like, how do we start doing that?
Mm,
Which is like what I'm wondering now, because I feel a lot of the fashion system and sustainable fashion system is still working in the old traditional way, and that doesn't leave much room. So it's almost like, we need to be creating systems, or
mm,
sorry, new systems outside of the prevalent system. And I think that's already starting to happen, like you said, like
mm,
grassroots movements, which is exciting, but I think it needs to be on a larger scale. And I think a lot of that does come down to, these systems that put the designer at the epicenter of everything, the holy grail, as we've called about, as we've talked about before, where the designer, it's just about what the designer designs and their creative output, and kind of everyone else in the supply chain is left, like, doesn't really have a voice. So it's, how do you include the work, the worker in Bangladesh who sewed a part of your garment? How does their voice come into play? The person who dyed the cotton, like everyone, like how do we make it, where it's not just about this one designer, where there's a power hierarchy? How do we,
mm,
levy out the power and, create a fashion, a sustainable fashion that is inviting and, celebrates this diversity? That's what I want to know. No. Mm,
yeah, I feel like it's going to be really messy as we figure it out. Um,
mm,
I feel like a lot of I feel like a lot of the industry feels like that's already happening, like with the conversations around transparency and things like that. But I actually like you alluded to, I feel like we actually have to go, here's the current system and actually completely remove everything from that and form a entirely new system that's founded upon new values and operate
mm,
from this new place because it's because what we're trying to do is to fit certain
Mm,
we're trying to fit things inside a system where they can't fit. Things like transparency don't work within this system. I can't remember
yeah.
who I read the quote by. I think I posted it up on our stories. I'll post it again afterwards. But she was saying that transparency without, it was something along the lines of like transparency without humanity um, is
Mm,
just like looking, like staring at someone through the looking glass. It was somewhere along the
mm,
lines of that. But that's what happens when we try to fit these kinds of values into a system that doesn't embrace that. There
mm,
has to be a new system so that things like transparency actually include um, like when you take transparency but you pair it with spiritual values that value a human for their innate for like that see a human being as being worthy of the same
mm.
of equal worth to yourself, then that transparency holds so much more power. That transparency actually has the power to change, the trajectory of our future as humanity. and
Mm,
and that can't happen when you're trying to fit those kinds of things within a colonial framework, which is what we're currently trying to do, because there is a hierarchy within a colonial framework, which says that the designer and the Western world's comfort is prioritized above everybody else. And if you
yeah.
try to fit transparency within that, it's either tokenistic or it's that missionary complex where it's like, oh, we'll add transparency so that we
Yeah.
it's not genuine, and it can't be genuine within that system. And
Mm,
therefore we need new systems in order for things like transparency to actually work.
yeah.
I don't know, that's my feelings about it, because I feel like we're trying to take these values and shove them in a framework where they're just
Yeah.
not going to fit with each other.
It's just like ticking boxes, which unfortunately I think is what a lot of CSR, corporate social responsibility initiatives within big companies are. There really isn't that connection to what's obviously
But
not every company,
yeah.
but yeah, and I guess like what you were speaking about, the colonialist systems, I guess a big part of that exclusion is connected to, like, I guess, colonialist and industrialized ideas around growth and efficiency.
Mm,
And when when everything's about generating ridiculous amounts of profit irresponsibly, then you'll do you make sacrifices to make that happen. And that's when you see issues with labor rights, environmental degradation, etc. But then that's also when you don't have time to include others' voices, when the workers' voices don't matter, when
mm,
people of color, indigenous peoples, LGBTQIA plus people, disabled people don't have a voice at the table because it doesn't fit into the mainstream paradigm of growth,
mm.
of excessive growth, which we can see is really not serving us anymore, our production and consumption growth habits.
Mm. There needs to be new markers for what growth means, and new markers for what progress means, and new
Yeah,
markers for what, profitability means when you talk
yeah,
about it in a business context. And um, the current ones just aren't going to serve us, aren't serving us now, and
nope.
are definitely not going to serve us in the future. Um, and this is why I think it's so important for us to continue to have these conversations, because
Mm,
um, although they can be super uncomfortable sometimes because because it seems as if you're pointing fingers at people
Mm,
when you say these things, and it can be super uncomfortable even just for you and I investigating these things, because these are,
mm,
these are beliefs that we've held at some point in our lives, or
yeah,
things that we've done personally at
yeah,
some point in our lives. So it's uncomfortable to face off with this kind of stuff, but it's not a good enough excuse anymore just to ignore it for the sake of not having an uncomfortable conversation. um I feel like our
mm,
future really depends on having uncomfortable conversations right now that
oh
extend
yeah,
beyond um just thinking about solutions. We cannot just have solutions. We can't keep piling on
mm,
solutions on top of a broken system and expect it to work. It's just
yeah,
driving me crazy.
yeah, yeah. I feel yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I guess like one thing I'm wondering now is what can we all do on a small or larger scale to start, these like droplets of diversity within our creative work or within like where the conversations we have. Yeah,
Mm.
can I ask you that, Amy? Perhaps.
Yeah,
What?
I mean,
Yeah.
I've been thinking about it a lot because I'm like,
Mm,
okay, so
mm,
we're identifying this, but now what do we actually do about it?
yeah.
And I feel like sometimes the answers aren't exactly as fast as we want them to be. I feel like there's several things we can do. First of
Mm,
all, it for those who come from different viewpoints or different cultural backgrounds, or um, are having, or doing research around this area or thinking about it
mm,
in a different way, I think it's important to use your voice now.
yeah.
um, I think it's really important to bring different viewpoints to the table. And if there isn't space at the table for you, just bring your lawn chair, pull it up, and
Mm,
be willing to have the conversations, even if it's messy.
yeah.
Um, Even if no one listens, who cares? Just use your voice, use it for yourself, even. Um, I think also it's super important to start asking questions, because you and I were talking about this before, which is why we're going to be starting the series that we're starting soon. But asking questions, I think questions are super important, because until we
Mm,
begin to ask the questions, we actually don't realize, you know,
mm,
we actually can't think any differently. Like, the questions are what start us thinking differently. So questioning the way we do things, why we do things this way, how come it's done this way.
mm,
And then that allows us to begin thinking differently, and to begin actually realizing that perhaps it doesn't have to be done this way. So I think asking questions is going to be a huge part of it, because until we've asked the questions, we actually can't take the next step.
yeah.
Um, at least that's what I think. I think until you've asked the questions, and you've asked good
Mm,
questions, you actually can't create a pathway forward,
yeah.
because you don't realize what needs to be different. Um,
Mm,
so I think that's going to be a huge part of it. Yeah,
mm,
I think those to me. I mean, I've been thinking about it a lot. I've been like, shit, what's the next step now?
yeah.
Um, I think those are two of the really big steps. Like, um, even just for example, the question around, this is a random one. It's related to diversity, but like, not so much about supply chains and stuff. When you design, like, this question, I was, so I heard someone bring it up, and I was like, what? Holy crap. Like, why did we never question that? When you design, when you're learning in design school how to draw a body and you learn the
Mm,
nine heads things.
yeah,
Do you remember that in
yeah.
illustration? Nine
Mm,
heads. When the person said it, I was like, oh yeah, I can imagine it right in my head. Um, you learn nine heads, how to proportion out a body, and
mm,
how the shoulders and the hips and whatever. There's a proportion that you learn in illustration that's so unrealistic. It's outrageous.
yeah,
But if you begin design that way from the very beginning, you're illustrating, um, and you're designing on this illustration that is so far from a real human body,
yeah.
and even more so from a diverse human body. From there's no diversity in that illustration. And if
Mm,
that's the beginning point where you're beginning to draw your clothes on, and then from there you're going out and making it and whatever, like asking questions about that. Why are we drawing like that? Like how is that designing for diversity if
mm,
we're designing on a body that first of all doesn't exist, and second of all, the closest thing to that is a very small minority of the population
yeah,
and is very exclusive. Um, so even just asking questions about that, even just
yeah,
just questioning everything. The point is just questioning
yeah.
everything, like from our design process through to the making process, through to retail,
Mm,
through to um, the systems we operate within, through everything, every single thing, like questioning it all.
yeah.
Um, I think that's gonna start for a lot of people, if we're asking good questions,
Mm,
it's gonna start us being like, whoa,
yeah.
what? Like,
Mm,
how did I not think about that before? This doesn't seem quite right. Just things we take for granted because it's been around for so long. And for a lot of us, we've been immersed in it for so long that things just become normal. And when things are
absolutely.
normal, you don't ask questions.
Mm. And it's like, how can you do that, I guess, from a place where you're not listening to all the noise?
Yeah.
And, especially if you are quite active in your practice, and on social media, that can get difficult. We're bombarded every day. So I think that's when you really need to cultivate a relationship with your inner self in whatever form that
Yes.
may look like. Because I think it's really hard to ask those deep questions and to listen if there is too much noise that you're not blocking out
Mm.
at some point of the day, in the day. Yeah, there's a lot happening at the moment. I guess one thing I did want to ask you, Amy, is like, I guess in my work, I'm because I do a bit of research work and writing, for those of you who don't know, and also teaching work. And I'm always wondering, how can I bring other voices into this conversation? And I come from a European background. How can I bring other voices into the conversation around fashion, around sustainability, whilst not appropriating, whilst being respectful, and when, yeah, how can I make room perhaps at the table for other voices when perhaps I need to be the one delivering the message, if that makes
Hmm.
sense? Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. I think first of all, you've done the biggest step, which is to identify that you can appropriate by, sharing knowledge that, perhaps you don't come from. I like that knowledge sharing, when you're representing it can be appropriation. Um,
Mm,
but I think you've identified the first step, which is that um, that certain knowledges I don't belong to certain people, but I mean,
Mm,
but I think that certain cultures have carried through certain ways of being and knowledges that are, specific to their heritage and their culture. Same as design, same as, clothes or anything else. Um, there's also knowledge.
mm,
And I think the first thing is that you've identified it. I think that's a major step. I don't think most people identify it. I think most people are just so used to um, either seeing appropriation that it's become normal,
mm,
so that it's not thought of as being a bad thing, or just get very excited and yeah, share it without asking those questions first.
mm,
So that's the first step. But second, I think is highlighting is I think is highlighting going back to the source to highlight the source. I think that goes a huge way
mm.
because it connects people to the root of it. Um,
Yeah.
and we talk about this a lot in our work, always going back to the source, going back to the root of it. Um,
Mm,
when we look at problems, going to the root of the problem. When we're sharing things, go to the root of it. And any great researcher will always do that, try to look for the root. So when you're sharing it, I think it's important to share, where it comes from. Go back to the
mm,
root instead of, if you can, um, for example, if you're researching and you come across a source that's perhaps Western and is talking about it from a Western point of view, about another
mm,
culture, then go one step further. Go to the culture itself. Look for someone
mm,
who's doing that work themselves. Um,
mm,
and highlight their work, rather than the researcher who's talking about it from a
mm,
Western viewpoint, because
mm.
you'll get a more pure source in the first
Yeah.
place. Um, I think that's a really healthy way to bring voices to the table when it's your job to actually present it. Um, yeah,
Mm,
it's a hard one
yeah.
because yeah, I do think that, and I feel this as well, that I do feel like um, a lot of the time in our work we're being asked to present something that perhaps is not native to ourselves,
Yeah.
or is somebody else's idea.
Mm,
Uh, but I think we can always do a good job of researching and go back and find the closest thing to the source that we can. Um,
mm.
yeah,
That's
I
super
think
helpful.
it's like helpful if maybe you talk a little bit more about cultivating the inner resilience and having that spiritual practice,
Mm,
when it comes to, asking these questions, because like you
mm,
touched on just before, you can't actually ask these questions if you don't have the capacity to do so within yourself.
mm.
Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe you can touch on it though, because I think that there's a lot of people who are really wanting to dive into this, but just don't have the capacity to ask the questions.
Yeah, well, I guess like we've spoken about, I think in a few of these lives, um, I think for this movement for sustainability, we really need to first cultivate a sustainable relationship with ourselves, with our inner selves, because everything comes from within. That's the outer world that we experience. And whether that's through mindfulness or meditation or dance or observing and walking around in nature, making art, whenever you're in that moment of stillness and deep, true connection to yourself, I think cultivating those moments is going to help you kind of, I think it'll develop your senses for starting, to start with, and it will help you develop your listening in that way, and you'll be able to ask these questions, and perhaps the answers won't pop up straight away, but you'll start to develop this awareness where they might, the answers might, or deeper questions might start popping up around you. But yeah, I think that's only going to be able to come when you really start tuning in with yourself and also what's happening with the world around you.
Mm.
And also because this is pretty deep questions we're asking, looking at potentially like creating new systems that have been in place for hundreds of years that benefit a lot of people, that benefit us. So it's, I guess it's a constant process, but you really do have to be quite, I think, rooted in a way to your inner being. I don't know if that makes sense. Rooted, yeah. I guess that develop that groundingness, and I find it's quite interesting once you start asking questions out loud or writing them out. The answers or deeper questions start coming up in quite unusual ways. Do you find that, Amy? It's quite funny. Once you start thinking about something. But yeah, definitely some sort of mindfulness practice and nature time is essential for this, because we're all interconnected beings. We're all interconnected to one another with the land. And we really, we need to be coming from that place of interconnection, because that's just going to propel us, and that's going to give us power to explore these things.
Yeah, and I would say that true diversity can only begin once you have cultivated that kind of spiritual earth connection, because it's in that connection that you realize that everything is connected to each other. Everything is interconnected. And without that realization, you actually can't allow diversity within your life. Or at least I don't think so. Not in a true, genuine, deep way, because there's still hierarchy existing. And it's in that spiritual practice, in that connection to earth, when you realize that everything is everything touches everything is connected, that all of a sudden that begins to inform the way that you do things. It begins to inform your understanding of what true diversity actually looks like.
Yeah. And I think, touching on the point you made before, that it's going to be messy, I think we just need to get, and I think that's fine. We need to get over our perfectionism, and we just need to have the courage to be vulnerable, and
totally.
And that's all beautiful.
Yeah, it is going to take a lot of courage. Because, to be honest, when you have been, and I use you as in not you, but I mean as in us, the Western world, when you've been at the top of the food chain, equality will always feel like you are a victim. Because you all of a sudden realize that, equality just, it brings you down a notch in terms of your comfort levels. So I think that it really will be messy for a little while, and we're going to have to be like, it is going to take that inner resilience and cultivating that deeper connection, because it isn't going to be easy. It's not going to be rainbows and butterflies and let's just all invite everyone to the table and it will be fun. What often happens when you invite everyone to the table is that for a little while it can sometimes be messy, because those who are invited to the table have histories of hurt.
Yeah.
That's just the truth. When we're dealing with things like systems of colonization or systems which have oppressed certain peoples for a long time, when equal voices are brought to the table, when everyone's allowed to self-represent, for a while, we are going to have to meet each other in healing at that table
Yeah.
because um, because it hasn't been a fair system and because a lot of people have been used and um, for the benefit of the West, for the comfort of the West. And so it is going to be messy for a while.
Mm,
But it's necessary. It's
yeah.
necessary. And if we talk about fairness and equality and diversity and all of these things, let's actually do it, not just talk
Yeah.
about it as in like, oh, it'll be diverse as long as our comfort levels are still the same and
Mm,
we don't have to sacrifice anything.
totally.
And
Yeah. It's like, how do we learn to listen better? Like, how do we
mm,
learn to listen, like, full stop? Especially us, like, I think in the Western world. Um,
mm.
hmm, lots of big questions there, things to dive into. Yeah, diversity is a big one. Hmm, guess, did you have anything else that was hot on your heart, Amy, that you wanted to
Mm.
explore?
No, I think for me it's just having a willingness to go through the messy phase with each other, as in
Yeah,
the collective, not just you and me.
yeah,
um, yeah, I think it's really a time for those of us who have been um, kind of having these discussions or being willing to look
mm,
at this work. I think it's really a time where it's important to use our voices.
yeah,
Yeah, I think it's a really important time to use our voices because otherwise we risk repeating the cycles
mm,
just with new and fancy sustainable solutions.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
guess we're also privileged to be here to be able to be discussing these things. So, like you said, we do need to use our voice for those that aren't as privileged.
For sure.
Yeah.
What about you? Have you got anything else that you wanted to bring up?
I think that was it. I think for me, I just wanted to kind of bring up the conversation for myself, but also others that are out there that do within their own work want to bring in Indigenous and more diverse voices into their work and conversation, but can be a bit afraid to because they want to do it
Mm,
in the most respectful way. And I think, yeah, I think you answered it. You know, it's going to be messy, but we need to do it. You know, we're going to fall and smack our heads and fuck it up at one point or the other, but like we have to use our privilege to do that.
mm, mm.
So that was what I kind of wanted to go into.
Amazing.
Great. So if anyone, we might wrap it up, hey? If
Perfect.
anyone has any questions or comments or what are they thinking about this and they want to shoot us something through, go for gold. Otherwise, we're going to post this up on our Linktree and our website if anyone wants to
Hmm.
watch, and we'll be back in here next week. And we're also going to start doing. Do you want to introduce
No, you go for it.
me?
I'm just
Okay.
excited. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
So we've been trying to think about how we can. Amy and I have been having very deep conversations around these ideas around sustainability and fashion and creation and this new paradigm. And we've been trying to think of ways of how we can engage others in this conversation online especially because we know so many of you are interested in these conversations, but perhaps sometimes can't get on the live or watch it. And so we thought we'd start creating these monthly or bi-monthly Zoom rooms where we pop a question up, and then between 10 to 20 of us gather live on Zoom. Bye. And we discuss this question just like like you used to do at uni. You sit around discussing deep questions, but sometimes perhaps now we don't have a platform to do. So that's what we're going to be starting. So we're going to post some details in the next few days. It's going to be really relaxed, just creatives getting in on a Zoom call one evening with a cup of tea, discussing what we actually want our future, the future of fashion, of sustainable fashion of our world to look like. And hopefully we can start putting that into being through these discussions.
I can't wait.
Yes, we're
I'm so
excited.
excited.
Yay!
I actually cannot wait to hear what everyone has to say and to listen to the ideas that are shared. And
Yeah.
yeah, I'm super excited for it.
And who knows
Yes,
what'll come of that. Awesome.
amazing stuff. Awesome. Well, we'll
Awesome.
see you next week. And yeah, thanks for joining us.